joining together in this extraordinary year of 2020, that what's unprecedented in our world isn't problems, isn't difficulties, not pandemic, not economic volatility. Those have been around forever. What's unprecedented is that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And that didn't just happen back then. God is constantly doing a new thing through Jesus and wants to bring something new into your life today. And over the next 3 days, actually, we're going to look at how Jesus shows us this in the beginning of his ministry, because God had a purpose for him beyond just his own comfort, and God has a purpose for you beyond your own comfort. Now, the beginning of his ministry is described in extraordinary ways. In the Gospel of Mark, what we're going to look at in the first chapter, he goes to the Jordan River, and it must have been very meaningful. His cousin John the Baptist is going to baptize him. And when he comes up out of the water, something extraordinary happens. The heavens are torn open, the text says. The idea is that Jesus is able to perceive spiritual reality, that the presence and love and activity of the Father is as visible to him as the earthly world is to us. When I first met Dallas Willard, the first conversation that we had, the thing that struck me more than anything else was just by the expression of his face and his body language. There was no hurry in him. There was this great humility. And it was clear from the way that Dallas would talk that the presence of God was as perceptible to him as the furniture in the room was to me. And this is what's going on in the life of Jesus now. He's just aware of the reality and presence of his Father. And then the voice comes from heaven and says, "This is my Son, whom I love, the beloved, with whom I am well pleased." Now, the first and last phrases in that, Jack Levison writes, come from passages in the Old Testament that describe vocation. "This is my Son" is from the 2nd Psalm, spoken of the king. He will rule the nations with an iron scepter. You're going to be the ruler, the king. You're going to have great power. The second phrase is from Isaiah 42, "the one in whom I am well pleased." That was the servant of God. That was the suffering servant of God who would live with pain and offer his life. And this is the vocation that Jesus will enter into. But then in between those two is just the little phrase, "whom I love." You might wonder, where's that from in the Old Testament? Well, it's not. God just made it up. He can do it. It's his book. And in a very intimate moment, he wants his Son to know, "You are the beloved." That's an amazing word. And maybe you need to hear that word today. Maybe you need to hear that you are God's beloved. And you might think that we're just going to stay and linger on that word, but that's not actually the thought for today, because Mark doesn't let us stay and linger there, because the Spirit does not let us stay and linger there. Mark says immediately, one of his favorite words, the Spirit drove Jesus out into the wilderness. Now, this is one of the most stunning statements in all of the New Testament. The wilderness, of course, is the place where nobody wants to go. The wilderness is barren. Wilderness is barren and uncomfortable and dangerous and isolated. It is filled with fears. And we're told here that it wasn't that Jesus said to himself, "I got a good idea. I think I'll go to the wilderness." The Spirit drives him out. It is such a strong and forceful word, in fact, that when Matthew and Luke tell this story, most scholars think that Mark was written first, and Matthew and Luke both use Mark as one of their resources. They both change that verb to soften. It's the Greek word ekbalein. The word ballistics comes from a form of that. And it's used in very violent ways. When Jesus drives the money changers out of the temple by force with whips, that's the verb that gets used. When Jesus says, "If your right eye causes you to stumble, pluck it out and throw it away," that's the verb that gets used. When Jesus drives evil spirits out of possessed, tormented people, that's the verb that gets used. Interestingly, in the Greek translation of the Old Testament, when Adam and Eve sin, defy God, and they are driven out of Eden, that's the word that's used. And that's what the Spirit does to Jesus. Now, if I was Jesus, when I was in the river with my cousin, I had this wonderful spiritual experience, and I hear that I'm the beloved, I would just want to stay at the river for a while. I would just want to bask in the warmth and the comfort of that. But no, not the Spirit. You know, we often think of the Spirit or hear about the Spirit as this source of great power and great comfort, and that's true, and the Spirit is, but that's not all that the Spirit is. The Spirit is also the one who drives Jesus into the place of battle, because Jesus did not come into this world primarily to have a comfortable set of circumstances. He came to give. He came to love. And now we begin to understand why the wilderness was going to be the place of temptation. See, temptation always involves the thought that maybe God doesn't really care about my well-being and I might have to look after myself. And this is true all the way back to the story of Adam and Eve, when the tempter says to Eve, "You will not certainly die. God knows if you take the fruit, if you defy him, your eyes will be open and you can't trust God." Now, Jesus is driven into the wilderness by the Spirit, and he will be tempted. And there's something very important going on that we'll see over the next couple of days. God will give to Jesus in the wilderness what God could not give to Jesus at the river. And that's true for you and me. So the word for today is, when you find yourself in the wilderness, when you are in the place of suffering or difficulty or confusion or temptation, do what Jesus did. Submit. Lean into the wilderness. Lean into the wilderness. Instead of asking, when can I get out of the desert? Ask, what can I get out of the desert? How can I grow? We all will experience this sometimes in life, and I and my family have, especially this last year. One day you are at the river, and then all of a sudden you're not. You are thrust out against your will into the place of aloneness, danger, fear. And it's very tempting in those times just to obsess over, how can I get out of here? When will this be done? And what Jesus does instead is he submits to the Spirit. He is in the wilderness for 40 days, you might remember. 40 days is often used in the scripture as an indefinite period of time, usually involving suffering, especially, of course, in the Exodus when Israel was in the wilderness for 40 years and they grumbled and complained and got it wrong. Now Jesus is going to get it right. And what I find is, when I ask myself the question, how can I get out of this? How can I get my circumstances to change? It can drive me crazy. But when I ask, God, how can I meet you here? When I submit to being in the wilderness, when I say, your will be done, I find meaning in the wilderness that redeems the wilderness. One of the writings that's been quite helpful to me is a man named Francis Fenelon, and he writes about our crosses, those sufferings that come into our life. And he says, don't resist your cross, because when you resist it, resisting the cross is often harder than bearing the cross itself. I have a real good friend going through a real difficult season, and he will say to himself sometimes, I haven't asked myself the question, why me? And that's generally a good thing, to not ask or obsess over the question, why me? But then a good question to ask is, what can I learn here? What can I get out of this experience? And what I think we can learn is that we can meet with God, we can be with God in the desert in a way that we can't quite be with him at the river. So if you're in the desert today, a loss, a grief, gone through a divorce, a big disappointment, a dream that has been shattered, a problem around health that you're not sure what the outcome will be, find God in the desert. Your will be done. And you will find him there. And I'll talk to you about that more tomorrow.